The difference between empire and obscurity often came down to how well a city built its harbor. In the medieval world, control over trade routes meant control over wealth itself, and that control began at the water's edge. Harbors were not simple docking points. They were strategic assets requiring sophisticated engineering to enable trade, naval dominance, and steady tax revenue. Some cities were blessed with natural bays and deep waters. Others had to create their own advantages through artificial marvels that reshaped coastlines and redirected currents. From the sun-soaked Mediterranean to the cold waters of the Baltic, rival powers poured enormous resources into harbor construction and maintenance. By the end of this video, you will understand how these engineering decisions determined which city-states rose to wealth and which faded into history. You will see how Venetian canals and Genoa's breakwaters were weapons in a silent war for commercial supremacy, and you will learn why the greatest harbors were not found but made through human ingenuity and relentless effort. What does it take to build a gateway that can command the wealth of an entire era? To answer that question, one must first understand that a medieval harbor was far more than a sheltered curve of coastline. It was the physical anchor of a vast economic system. Every ship that arrived carried not just goods but taxes, information, and influence. A well-protected harbor could dictate which merchants paid what fees, which goods moved freely, and which rivals were squeezed out of the market. Control over trade routes began with control over the places where those routes touched land. Not all harbors were created equal. Historians describe a kind of harbor hierarchy that shaped the medieval world. At the top were the primary emporia, the great hubs where far-reaching trade routes converged. Think of Venice commanding the Adriatic, Constantinople linking Europe and Asia, or Bruges connecting the North Sea to the Flemish cloth trade. These cities did not just happen to be located on good bays. They deliberately engineered their harbors to handle enormous volumes of cargo, to protect ships from storms, and to guard against attack. At the next level were secondary feeder ports, smaller harbors that collected local resources like timber, grain, or wool, and channeled them toward the primary emporia. These feeder ports often had natural advantages but lacked the deep channels or protective walls needed for year-round large-scale shipping. Their role depended entirely on the larger hubs staying open and stable. What made a city rise to the top of this hierarchy was rarely luck. It was engineering. A primary emporium needed a harbor that could accommodate the largest merchant galleys of the era, ships with deep drafts that required at least 3 to 4 meters of water. It needed breakwaters to calm waves, stone piers to handle loading and unloading, and secure basins where goods could be stored and guarded. It also needed a way to maintain the harbor's depth against the constant threat of silt buildup. Every year, sediment from rivers and coastal currents would slowly fill in the channel. Without regular dredging or clever designs to redirect the flow, a thriving harbor could become useless within a generation. The cities that invested in this unseen, unglamorous work were the ones that kept their wealth flowing. Consider the choice facing a medieval ruler. A natural bay might offer some protection, but without artificial additions, it would never handle the volume needed to become a primary emporium. The decision to build a stone breakwater stretching hundreds of meters into the sea was not a small one. It required vast amounts of labor, quarrying, and transport, all financed by taxes that could take years to repay. But the payoff was enormous. A well-built breakwater created calm water where dozens of ships could dock at once, safe from the wind and the enemy. It allowed cargo to be loaded and unloaded quickly, reducing the time a ship spent in port and increasing the number of voyages it could complete in a season. Every day saved meant more profit, so when rival powers competed for trade, they were really competing for harbor infrastructure. a city that lagged behind in dredging or wharf construction would find its merchants migrating to a better-equipped neighbor. The harbor hierarchy was not fixed. It shifted as cities invested or neglected their waterfronts. This dynamic created a constant pressure to improve, to innovate, and to spend. Venetian engineers learned to drive thousands of wooden piles into the mud of the lagoon to create stable foundations. Genoese builders discovered how to construct massive stone piers that could withstand the worst Mediterranean storms. Each advance was a bid to climb the hierarchy and seize a larger share of the world's commerce. This brings us to the critical question: what separated the cities that succeeded from those that fell behind? The answer often came down to a single factor: the willingness to master the coastline rather than simply accept it. In the next part of the story, we will see how two of the most powerful maritime republics, Venice and Genoa, turned harbor engineering into an art of war and wealth. Long before Venice rose, simple piers and wooden jetties marked the first steps. Ancient communities found sheltered coves and built crude stone platforms where boats could tie up without grounding. A few large boulders stacked along the shore broke the worst of the waves, but these were passive structures. They used what nature offered and added only the bare minimum. By the Roman era, engineers had learned to mix volcanic ash with lime to create a concrete that set underwater. This allowed them to build massive breakwaters and quays that reshaped entire coastlines. After the fall of Rome, that knowledge was not entirely lost, but it faded. For centuries, harbor builders returned to timber and rubble. Then, as trade began to revive in the 11th and 12th centuries, a new generation of engineers rediscovered the old techniques and pushed them further. The first major innovation was the revival of Roman concrete. Medieval builders in Italy and Byzantium experimented with local volcanic materials. Pozzolana, a fine volcanic ash from the region around Naples, proved particularly effective. Mixed with lime and aggregate, it hardened into a substance that could withstand constant saltwater erosion. This was not a simple recipe. Getting the proportions right required trial and error, and the concrete had to be poured in forms that were themselves built underwater. But the payoff was enormous. A concrete breakwater could be shaped precisely, extended hundreds of meters into the sea, and last for generations. It turned a natural bay into a controlled basin. Next came the coffin dam. This device was essentially a watertight enclosure built on the seafloor. Workers drove two concentric rings of wooden piles into the seabed, filled the gap between them with clay or packed earth, and then pumped out the water inside the enclosure. Once the interior was dry, they could excavate down to solid ground, lay foundations, and build stone piers or wharves in what had been open water. Coffin dams were dangerous and labor-intensive. The wood had to be strong enough to withstand the pressure of the surrounding sea, and any leak could flood the workspace in minutes. Yet they allowed harbors to be built in places where no natural shelter existed, creating deep water berths right against the shoreline. The third essential technique was dredging. Silt and sand constantly drifted into harbor basins, carried by currents and rivers. A channel that was 4 meters deep in spring might be only 3 meters by autumn, too shallow for the largest merchant vessels. Medieval engineers developed simple but effective methods to remove this sediment. They used long-handled scoops operated from boats, or they anchored rafts with buckets that were lowered and raised by hand. Some harbors employed teams of workers who waded into the shallows with shovels and baskets during low tide. It was slow, back-breaking work, but it kept the trade routes open. Cities that neglected dredging saw their harbors shrink and their commerce migrate to rivals. These three innovations, underwater concrete, coffin dams, and continuous dredging, marked a profound shift. Instead of merely finding a good bay and building a small dock, communities began actively modifying the coastline to suit their needs. They deepened channels, extended piers, and created artificial basins where none existed. This was the transition from passive use to active engineering, and it set the stage for the two great rivals who would turn harbor construction into a weapon of economic war. On the surface of the Adriatic Sea, two city-states built their fortunes not with armies but with stone and water. Venice and Genoa were not always rivals. In the early centuries of the medieval period, both were rising ports trying to carve a share of the Mediterranean trade. But by the 12th century, their ambitions collided. And the weapon they chose was their harbor. Venice had the advantage of a lagoon, a vast shallow basin protected from the open sea by a chain of narrow islands. But that protection came with a cost. The lagoon was too shallow for large merchant galleys. Venetian engineers had to dig deep channels through the mud, dredge constantly to keep them open, and drive thousands of wooden piles into the soft ground to create stable foundations for stone quays. Every meter of deep water was a victory against nature. Genoa, by contrast, faced a different problem. Its natural harbor was a deep bay, but it was exposed to the full force of Mediterranean storms and vulnerable to attack from the sea. So Genoa's builders constructed massive stone breakwaters that stretched hundreds of meters into the water, creating a calm inner basin where ships could anchor safely. They also fortified the harbor entrance with chains and towers, controlling every vessel that entered. These were not passive improvements, they were deliberate strategies to seize control of the trade routes. Venice built the Arsenal, a vast shipyard and harbor complex where galleys could be constructed, repaired, and stored. The Arsenal was not just a dock. It was an industrial zone that allowed Venice to produce warships faster than any rival. Meanwhile, Genoa focused on creating a network of fortified harbors along the coast of the eastern Mediterranean, from the Black Sea to the Levant, each one a stepping stone for its merchant fleets. The rivalry between these two republics was not fought on battlefields alone. It was fought in the shape of their coastlines. Every new pier, every deepened channel, every artificial island gave one side an advantage in the race for trade. A city that could load and unload cargo faster, protect its ships from storms and pirates, and control access to its harbor could dictate the terms of commerce. Venetian merchants could afford to offer lower prices because their harbor was more efficient. Genoa's captains could sail with confidence, knowing they had safe ports to retreat to along their routes. The competition pushed both republics to innovate. Venice experimented with movable gates and sluices to control water flow and prevent siltation. Genoa developed techniques to anchor breakwaters on rocky seabeds where traditional foundations would not hold. Each advance was a bid to outdo the other, and the stakes could not have been higher. Control of the Mediterranean trade routes meant control of the spices, silks, and precious metals that fueled the entire European economy. The city that mastered its harbor mastered the sea, and the one that fell behind would watch its wealth drain away to a rival. This silent war of engineering would continue for centuries, shaping not just the fortunes of Venice and Genoa, but the entire balance of power in the medieval world. What happened when that rivalry escalated beyond harbor improvements into open conflict? That is where the story turns from construction to confrontation. Within the Venetian lagoon, one structure redefined what a harbor could be. The Arsenal of Venice was not just a shipyard. It was a self-contained world of engineered waterways, fortified walls, and standardized production. Here, harbor engineering and industrial organization merged into a single, relentless machine. Its layout was a marvel of purposeful design. The Arsenal occupied a vast enclosed basin, connected to the lagoon by a single guarded entrance. Inside, a network of canals sliced through the complex, lined with covered sheds and dry docks. Every canal led to a specific stage of shipbuilding. Timber arrived at one dock, was shaped in adjacent workshops, and then moved along the water to the assembly area. The entire process was choreographed like a clockwork. No raw material sat idle, no worker wasted steps. What made the arsenal truly revolutionary was its use of prefabrication. Shipbuilders did not carve each component from scratch for every new vessel. Instead, they kept stores of standardized parts, pre-cut planks, ready-shaped ribs, identical fittings. When a new galley was ordered, workers simply selected the correct pieces from storage and assembled them on the slipway. This approach slashed construction time from months to weeks and eventually to days. One famous account from the 15th century tells of a galley built, fitted, and launched in a single day for a visiting French king. The speed was not a trick. It was the result of careful engineering of the entire production line. The integration of the arsenal with the city's canals and lagoon defenses gave Venice an unmatched strategic advantage. The same shallow lagoon that kept enemy warships at a distance allowed Venetian galleys to move freely through the city's internal waterways. A ship built in the arsenal could pass directly into the lagoon, then out to the Adriatic, without ever crossing open sea where it might be intercepted. The arsenal also functioned as a secure harbor within a harbor. Its fortified walls and guarded gates meant that the entire Venetian war fleet could be built, repaired, and stored under protection. An enemy would have to capture the city to reach the ships. This engineering advantage translated directly into economic and military influence. Because Venice could produce warships faster than any rival, it could project power across the Mediterranean with fewer resources tied up in long construction cycles. A defeated fleet could be replaced within weeks. A merchant convoy threatened by pirates could be escorted by newly built galleys almost on demand. This speed allowed Venice to dominate trade routes, enforce blockades, and respond to crises before competitors could even muster a response. The arsenal was not merely a naval base, it was the physical embodiment of Venetian efficiency, a harbor engineered to manufacture victory, and it stood as a constant challenge to rivals like Genoa, who had to rely on slower, more traditional shipbuilding scattered across multiple ports. The question that followed was simple: could any other city match this level of integration? Genoa answered Venice's challenge by turning its rocky coast into a fortress of commerce. Where Venice built its harbor inside a sheltered lagoon, Genoa faced the open Mediterranean directly. Its shoreline was exposed to violent storms, and the natural bay, while deep, offered little protection from attack or from the constant buildup of sediment washing down from the surrounding hills. To survive, Genoa had to engineer its harbor from scratch, and the result was the Molo Vecchio, the old pier, a stone breakwater that changed the city's fate. The Molo Vecchio was not a simple wall. It was a carefully constructed arm of stone and concrete that extended almost 400 meters into the sea, curling slightly to create a calm inner basin. Builders quarried massive blocks of local stone and lowered them into the water using wooden cranes and barges. They mixed pozzolana, the volcanic ash that set underwater, to bind the stones together into a single unbreakable mass. Over years of labor, the breakwater grew, taming the waves and giving ships a safe place to anchor and unload. Behind this stone shield, Genoa built new quays and warehouses, transforming a vulnerable coastline into one of the busiest ports in the Mediterranean. But the breakwater alone was not enough. The same currents that brought wealth also brought silt. Every winter, runoff from the nearby mountains carried sand and mud into the harbor, slowly filling the deep channel that allowed the largest merchant galleys to dock. Genoa's engineers responded with systematic dredging on a scale that rivaled Venice. They organized teams of workers who operated long scoops from barges, digging out the accumulated muck and dumping it far from the harbor entrance. They built stone jetties to redirect the flow of sediment, forcing it away from the main channel, and they instituted a regular schedule so that dredging became a continuous, year-round operation rather than a crisis response. A city that stopped dredging for even a single season risked losing its commercial edge. This relentless effort to improve the harbor gave Genoa a decisive advantage in the race for eastern trade. While Venice relied on its lagoon and its arsenal, Genoa used its deep, open water port to launch faster voyages to the Black Sea and the Levant. Genoa's merchants established colonies and trading posts along the shores of the Byzantine Empire in the Crimea and even as far as Persia. They brought back spices like pepper and cinnamon, silks from China, and precious stones from India. Each shipload of luxury goods that arrived at the Molo Vecchio was taxed and traded, fueling the city's rise. In the 13th and 14th centuries, Genoa reached its peak. Its harbor was the busiest in the western Mediterranean, handling more tonnage than any rival except Venice. The city's wealth paid for magnificent palaces, churches, and public works that still stand today. The Molo Vecchio became a symbol of human determination, a people who refused to accept the limits of their coastline and instead reshaped it to their will. Yet competition with Venice never ceased. The two republics fought a series of wars, some outright and some economic, each side pouring resources into harbor improvements to gain an edge. Genoa's engineers experimented with new breakwater designs, deeper channels, and stronger foundations. They understood that in this silent race, the prize was not just a piece of shoreline, but control over the very flow of goods and gold that connected Europe to the riches of the East. The question that lingered was how long such an engineered advantage could last, especially when every storm and every current worked to undo what human hands had built. In the cold waters of the Baltic, a different kind of harbor engineering took shape. While Venice and Genoa competed as individual city-states, the Hanseatic League built a network of ports that shared a single purpose: to move goods cheaply and reliably across the northern seas. This was not a rivalry between two republics. It was a collective effort of dozens of cities from Lübeck to Danzig, each contributing to a system that reduced costs and multiplied the strength of all. The key was standardization. Merely having a deep channel or a sturdy pier was not enough. The League needed every port to function in the same way, so that a ship captain arriving in Hamburg could expect the same crane design, the same warehouse layout, and the same customs procedures he had used in Riga. This uniformity turned the Baltic into a seamless trade zone. At the heart of this system lay the common crane. In Lübeck, the League built a massive treadwheel crane on the quay, a wooden machine powered by men walking inside a giant wheel. The same design appeared in Hamburg and in Danzig and in dozens of smaller ports. A merchant could load or unload heavy barrels of herring or salt using the same technique in any harbor. This meant no wasted time learning new equipment, no damaged cargo from unfamiliar handling. The cranes were not just tools, they were symbols of the League's commitment to shared efficiency. Warehouses followed strict standards too. They were built close to the water with large doors opening directly onto the quay and interior spaces divided into uniform storage cells. Goods could be sorted, inspected, and taxed without moving them far from the ship. The result was a reduction in loading time by as much as half compared to ports outside the League. But the greatest engineering achievement of the Hanseatic system was collective maintenance. The Baltic harbors faced a relentless enemy: silt and sand carried by rivers like the Trav and the Vistula. No single city could afford the constant dredging needed to keep channels deep. The solution was a shared fund. The League taxed all goods moving through its ports, and the revenue paid for dredging fleets that moved from harbor to harbor, clearing sediment before it became a problem. This was not charity, it was a calculated investment. Every city that contributed to the fund benefited from deeper channels in all others because trade routes were interdependent. A silting channel in Danzig slowed down shipping to Lübeck, and a delay in Lübeck raised costs for Hamburg. The collective approach made the entire network more reliable than any individual kingdom could manage on its own. Individual kingdoms like Denmark or Sweden, which had single major ports, often struggled to maintain their harbors. A single storm or a lean year would force them to neglect dredging, and their harbors would slowly become impassable. The League, by pooling resources, could absorb such shocks. When one port needed repairs, the others carried a slightly larger share until the work was done. This resilience gave the Hanseatic cities a decisive competitive edge. Their ships could count on reliable berths and predictable fees, while merchants from rival kingdoms risked grounding their vessels on shoals or waiting days for an overloaded crane. The lesson from the Baltic was clear. When harbor engineering was not a weapon of rivalry but a tool of cooperation, the whole network grew stronger. The League's ports became the backbone of a trade system that spanned from London to Novgorod, linking the riches of the north with the markets of the south. Yet even this collective system faced challenges, as the next part of the story reveals about the limits of shared power when new technologies and ambitions began to shift the balance of the medieval world. Across the medieval world, a ship leaving harbor at dusk faced a simple but terrifying problem. The sea turned black and the coast became invisible. Without a landmark to steer by, a captain could easily drift onto a reef or miss the entrance to a safe port entirely. The difference between a profitable voyage and a total loss often came down to a single light burning in the darkness. Lighthouses were not a medieval invention. The ancient world had the Pharos of Alexandria, a towering stone structure that guided ships into one of the busiest harbors of antiquity. But that great beacon fell into ruin long before the medieval period began. What rose in its place were smaller, more practical towers scattered along the coasts of Europe and the Mediterranean. Medieval engineers built them from local stone or timber, often on headlands or at the tips of breakwaters. At the top, a fire burned in an iron basket or a stone brazier, fed by wood, coal, or oil. Some towers used mirrors of polished metal to throw the light farther across the waves. Constantinople, the great capital of the Byzantine Empire, relied on a series of such beacon towers to guide ships through the treacherous currents of the Bosporus. The city also built massive rubble-mound breakwaters along its southern shore, piles of stone and concrete that broke the force of waves before they could smash a vessel against the seawall. These breakwaters were not elegant. They were giant heaps of rock dumped into the water and allowed to settle, but they worked. They created calm basins where merchants could anchor without fear of their hulls being crushed against the quay. The impact of these structures on trade was immediate and measurable. A harbor with a prominent lighthouse and sturdy breakwaters became known as a safe harbor. Shipwreck rates in such ports dropped significantly. Insurance, in the form of maritime loans or risk-sharing agreements among merchants, became cheaper because the chance of losing a ship at the entrance of the port was smaller. Merchants began to plan their routes around these beacons, choosing to pay higher docking fees at a protected port rather than risk the lower fees at an exposed one. This shift in behavior created a virtuous cycle. A port that invested in a lighthouse attracted more ships. More ships generated more customs revenue. That revenue paid for maintenance of the beacon and for further improvements to the harbor. Over time, the port gained a reputation for reliability, and that reputation itself became an asset. Prestige followed. A city with a well-lit, well-defended harbor was seen as a serious power, a place where trade could flourish without constant fear of disaster. The competition for this prestige drove the spread of lighthouse engineering. By the late medieval period, major ports from Genoa to Lübeck had erected stone towers, each one a silent advertisement of safety. The Hanseatic League, ever practical, built beacon towers along the Baltic coast and marked dangerous shoals with wooden stakes and floating buoys. These were not grand monuments like the Pharos. They were working tools maintained by guilds and harbor masters who understood that a single unlit night could cost a ship full of grain or herring. In this way, lighthouses and breakwaters became part of the invisible infrastructure of wealth. They did not load cargo or negotiate sales, but without them, the entire network of medieval trade would have been slower, more expensive, and far more dangerous. The next time a merchant calculated his profit, he was unknowingly relying on the stone tower that burned every night at the harbor mouth, and that tower, in turn, depended on the same engineering skill that had reshaped coastlines and dredged channels. The race for safer harbors was not separate from the race for deeper ones. It was the same race. Depth was a prize that had to be won again and again. A harbor could be cut deep into the shoreline, protected by breakwaters and lit by beacon fires, but if the seabed rose by even a few centimeters each year, the largest ships would soon be forced to anchor miles offshore. The work of keeping a harbor deep was invisible to most travelers. It happened beneath the waterline, in the mud and the current, and it required constant attention that no single construction project could solve. Medieval engineers understood that silting was not a problem you solved once. It was a condition you managed forever. The basic technique was simple but brutally labor-intensive. Teams of workers in small boats would lower a long pole with a bucket or a scoop attached to the end. They would scrape the bottom, lift the load, and dump the sediment into a barge that carried it away to be deposited far from the harbor entrance. This was slow, monotonous work. A single boat could clear only a few cubic meters of silt in a day, and a busy harbor needed thousands of cubic meters removed every year just to stay stable. Some ports employed dozens of these dredging boats, operating from dawn to dusk in a continuous cycle that never stopped. The cost was high, but the cost of letting the harbor fill was far higher. A few cities developed clever ways to reduce the burden. Silt traps were one such innovation. Engineers built low stone walls or wooden barriers at the mouths of rivers and creeks that fed into the harbor. These traps slowed the flow of water, causing sediment to settle before it reached the main basin. Workers could then clean the traps more easily than they could dredge the entire harbor floor. In some places, they dug secondary channels that diverted silt-laden water away from the anchorage altogether, letting it empty into a less valuable part of the coastline. These were not glamorous structures. They were low walls hidden beneath the surface, known only to the harbor masters and the dredging crews who maintained them. But they multiplied the effectiveness of human labor many times over. The dry dock was another essential tool that emerged during this period. A dry dock was a basin carved into the shore, connected to the harbor by a gate that could be closed and sealed. Workers would guide a ship into the basin, close the gate, and then pump out the water using hand-operated pumps or buckets. Once the basin was empty, the ship sat on wooden blocks, its entire hull exposed below the waterline. This allowed shipwrights to inspect and repair planks that were normally hidden, replace damaged timbers, and apply fresh coatings of pitch or tar to protect against rot and barnacles. Without dry docks, a ship would eventually become too waterlogged or too weak to sail safely, and replacing a vessel was far more expensive than maintaining one. Dry docks also allowed harbor engineers to study their own work. They could see how currents had scoured or filled the harbor floor over the course of a season and adjust their dredging strategies accordingly. The most famous cautionary tale of silting belongs to the Zwin Channel, the narrow waterway that served the great Flemish city of Bruges. In the 13th and 14th centuries, Bruges was one of the wealthiest trading hubs in northern Europe. Its merchants dealt in cloth from Flanders, wool from England, and spices from the Mediterranean. The city was connected to the North Sea by the Zwin, a natural channel that wound through the coastal marshes. But the Zwin was shallow and prone to silting. Every tide brought sand and mud from the sea, and every winter storm shifted the channel further. The city invested heavily in dredging, building spillways, and constructing wooden jetties to direct the flow. For a time, these efforts kept the channel open. Ships of moderate draft could still reach the quays of Bruges, and the city prospered. But the Zwin was fighting against a relentless geological process. The coastline of Flanders was slowly building outward as rivers carried sediment from the interior. The channel grew shallower with each decade, and the amount of dredging needed to keep it passable rose beyond what the city could afford. By the 15th century, the largest merchant vessels could no longer reach Bruges at all. They had to anchor at the outer port of Sluys, and cargo was transferred by smaller lighters for the final leg of the journey. This added time, cost, and risk. Merchants began to look elsewhere for more reliable harbors. Antwerp, with its deeper connection to the Scheldt River, rose to take Bruges' place. The wealth that had once flowed through Bruges drained away to its rival, and the city entered a long decline that it never reversed. Bruges was not alone. Across Europe, ports that failed to engineer against silting faced the same fate. Ravensburg, a once bustling Baltic hub, saw its harbor fill with sediment from the Oder River and lost its position to Stettin. The English port of Dunwich, built on a cliff that eroded and a harbor that silted, gradually sank into the sea. Each of these stories carried the same lesson: a harbor was not a static asset. It was a living system that required constant intervention. The city that neglected its dredging for a single season might find its channel too shallow for the next year trade. The city that invested in silt traps, dry docks, and regular maintenance could keep its doors open to the world. The most successful ports treated dredging not as a chore but as a core part of their identity. The harbor masters of Venice, Genoa, and the Hanseatic cities understood that their wealth depended on mud and water as much as on silk and gold. They budgeted for dredging every year, trained specialized crews, and passed laws to protect the channels from dumping or obstruction. This unseen work, carried out in all weather by laborers who rarely received credit, was what kept the trade routes flowing. The great stone quays and towering lighthouses captured the imagination. But it was the slow, patient scraping of silt from the seabed that decided which cities would rise and which would be buried by the same tide that had once carried their fortune. Constantinople sat at a crossroads where geography itself demanded constant engineering. The city straddled the narrow waterway that connected the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, a funnel through which grain, furs, timber, and slaves from the north met the wine, oil, and luxury goods of the south. Whoever controlled that passage could tax every ship that passed, and the Byzantine capital built its harbor network to do exactly that. The centerpiece was the Golden Horn, a horn-shaped inlet about 7 kilometers long that provided a deep, sheltered anchorage protected from the fierce currents of the Bosporus. But nature alone was not enough. The Byzantines added 2 massive artificial harbors along the southern shore of the peninsula, the harbor of Theodosius and the harbor of Neorian. Both were carved into the coastline using excavated basins, stone quays, and breakwaters made of rubble and concrete. The harbor of Theodosius, built in the late 4th century, could hold dozens of grain ships from Egypt, while the harbor of Neorian, closer to the city center, handled smaller vessels and military supplies. These were not simple docks. They were engineered basins enclosed by walls, with gates that could be closed to create a protected pool of still water. The most famous defensive feature was the great chain that stretched across the entrance to the Golden Horn. This was a massive iron and wooden barrier, floated on logs, that could be raised between 2 towers to block any enemy fleet from entering the inlet. When the chain was down, merchant ships sailed freely into the calm waters of the harbor. When it was up, the Golden Horn became a fortress. The chain was not just a barrier. It was a signal of Byzantine authority, reminding every captain that access to the city's harbors was a privilege granted by the emperor. For centuries, this network worked brilliantly. Constantinople became the greatest emporium of the medieval world, a place where traders from Russia, Scandinavia, the Islamic world, and Latin Europe mingled in the markets along the water. The harbors generated enormous customs revenue that funded the imperial court and the army, but maintaining that system was a constant struggle. The same currents that made the Bosporus a strategic choke point also carried enormous amounts of silt from the rivers of the Black Sea into the harbors. The excavators of the Theodosian harbor had originally dug a basin 400 meters long and over 6 meters deep. Within a few generations, that depth had shrunk by nearly half. Every year, Byzantine harbor masters organized dredging crews, but the scale of the problem overwhelmed their resources. Unlike the Venetian arsenal, which was a single centralized facility, Constantinople had multiple harbors spread along the coastline, each one silting at its own rate. The emperors could not afford to dredge all of them continuously. By the 12th century, the harbor of Neorian had become so shallow that only small boats could use it. The great grain ships from Egypt had to anchor in the open roadstead and transfer their cargo to lighters, a process that added costs and delays. While Constantinople struggled with silt, the Italian maritime republics were building deeper, better-maintained ports. Venetian galleys could dock directly at the quays of their lagoon. Genoa's ships could pull up to the stone piers behind the Molo Vecchio, but a Byzantine merchant unloading at the Theodosian harbor had to wait for a shallow draft barge to carry his goods ashore, and that barge might be delayed by weather or by the sheer volume of traffic. The efficiency gap widened with every passing decade. The Byzantines knew what needed to be done, but the political and financial resources to do it were slipping away. The empire that had once built the chain and the artificial harbors could no longer afford the constant, unglamorous work of maintaining them. And while the chain could still be raised to defend against a naval attack, it could not stop the slow invasion of silt that was quietly closing the city's doors to the world. The Golden Horn remained deep enough for smaller vessels, but the days when Constantinople could claim the finest harbor network in the Mediterranean were fading, just as the Italian republics were perfecting their own. While the Byzantine harbors slowly filled with silt, a different tradition of harbor engineering was reaching its peak across the Islamic world. In cities like Alexandria and Basra, knowledge of tides, winds, and sediment was not just practical experience but a science recorded in detailed treatises, studied by generations of engineers and navigators. The Abbasid and Fatimid periods saw the construction of artificial basins and deep water quays that rivaled anything in Europe, connecting the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean through a network of ports designed for efficiency and resilience. To understand how these harbors worked, we must start with Alexandria, a city with a harbor history stretching back to the pharaohs itself. After the chaos of the Crusades, the city was rebuilt under the Fatimid and later Ayyubid rulers. The old Roman harbor had been neglected, its breakwaters cracked and its channels clogged. Islamic engineers approached the problem with a systematic mind. They studied the prevailing winds, noting how the Mediterranean summer breezes shifted in the afternoon and how winter gales came from the northwest. They learned that a breakwater angled just slightly against the current could reduce silt buildup by deflecting sediment away from the entrance. The result was a restructured harbor with two main basins, one for commercial ships and one for naval vessels, each protected by stone moles built from local limestone and cemented with hydraulic mortar. The new harbor could handle the largest cargo ships of the era, carrying grain from Egypt, spices from the east, and textiles from Syria. But the true innovation was in the codification of knowledge. Scholars like Ahmad ibn Majid and al-Muqaddasi wrote about coastal geography, not as dry lists of ports but as living descriptions of currents, shoals, and safe anchorages. They described how to read the color of the water to spot hidden sandbars, how the behavior of seabirds indicated nearby land, and how the phase of the moon affected tidal ranges in the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf. These treatises were practical manuals for captains and harbor masters. One famous work, the Kitab al-Fawaid, explained the seasonal wind patterns of the Indian Ocean, allowing sailors to plan voyages that would catch the monsoon winds and avoid the storms. This was not just navigation, It was the intellectual infrastructure that made long-distance trade reliable. In Basra, at the head of the Persian Gulf, engineers faced a different challenge. The city sat on the Shatt al-Arab waterway, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers meet the sea. The water was shallow and constantly shifting with the immense load of silt carried by both rivers. To create a useful harbor, Abbasid engineers dug a series of artificial basins connected by canals, each basin protected by gates that could be closed during floods or low tide. They lined the basins with stone revetments to prevent erosion and built long stone jetties that extended into the deeper channels of the river. The basins acted like settling tanks, allowing silt to drop out of the water before it reached the main anchorage. Workers could then dredge the basins more easily than the river itself. This system allowed Basra to become the primary port for goods arriving from India, China, and East Africa. Spices, textiles, precious stones, and timber flowed into the city, were taxed, and then transferred to caravans heading for Baghdad and the markets of the Mediterranean. The knowledge of silt management was not a secret. Treatises on hydrology and water management, such as the work of al-Karaji in the 10th century, explained how to calculate the volume of sediment carried by a river and how to design canals that minimized deposition. Harbor engineers in Basra applied these principles to maintain their channels for centuries. The result was a system that did not just fight against nature but worked with it, using the same river that brought the silt to also carry away the dredged material. This integration of scientific knowledge with practical engineering gave Islamic harbor cities a remarkable durability. While European ports often declined when their channels silted, cities like Alexandria and Basra could adapt by applying principles recorded in books. The tradition of writing down what worked meant that even after a period of neglect, a later generation could pick up a manual and rebuild the harbor correctly. This continuity of knowledge was a form of intellectual capital that rivaled the physical stone of breakwaters. It allowed trade to flow across the vast Islamic world, from the spice markets of Malacca to the silk bazaars of Cairo, all linked by harbors that were not just places to dock but systems of engineered efficiency. The question that naturally arises is what happened when this knowledge met the harbors of a rising power farther east, where the monsoon winds demanded a different kind of mastery. Defense and commerce were two sides of the same stone. A harbor crowded with merchant ships was also a target. The same infrastructure that attracted trade attracted danger, and any port that failed to account for this vulnerability was leaving its wealth exposed. For this reason, the best harbors were not just engineered for depth and efficiency. They were engineered for defense, and the walls, towers, and chain barriers that protected them were as essential as the finest concrete breakwater. The integration began at the harbor entrance, the most vulnerable point in any port design. A chain stretched across the mouth, supported by floating logs or anchored to stone pillars on either side, could block an entire fleet. The chain was not a thin rope. It was a massive assembly of iron links, each one forged to withstand the tension of a ship under full sail or the repeated ramming of a warship. Behind the chain, towers flanked the entrance, their parapets lined with catapults or, in later centuries, with cannon. Any vessel that attempted to force the passage would be caught in a deadly crossfire, pelted from two sides while unable to maneuver in the confined space. This was not just a barrier, it was a trap designed to punish aggression before it could reach the inner basin. The island of Rhodes offered one of the most complete examples of this defensive philosophy. The Knights Hospitaller had transformed the harbor into a fortress. A massive chain stretched from the tower of St. Nicholas on the northern mole to a matching tower on the opposite shore. Behind that chain lay a calm, protected basin where merchant galleys could unload their cargo in safety. The walls of the city ran down to the water, and every quay was covered by archers stationed on the ramparts. The message was clear: Anyone who attacked this harbor would have to defeat the chain, then the towers, then the walls, and finally the garrison itself. The result was a harbor that remained a safe haven for Christian shipping for generations, attracting trade from across the Mediterranean. Merchants were willing to pay higher fees at Rhodes because they knew their goods would not be seized overnight. The Crusader port of Acre took a different but equally effective approach. Instead of relying on a single chain, Acre used a series of submerged obstacles and deliberately narrowed channels to control the approach of every vessel. The entrance was a winding path through underwater rocks and sunken barriers, known only to local pilots. A ship that deviated from the safe channel risked tearing its hull open on jagged stone. Along this forced route, towers and wall-mounted catapults covered every turn. The design was not just about blocking enemies, it was about controlling them, forcing every ship to slow down, follow a precise path, and submit to inspection before it ever reached the quay. Acre's harbor masters knew exactly who was entering and could deny access to anyone they deemed a threat. This careful management of movement turned the harbor into a secure zone where trade could proceed without the constant fear of a sudden raid. Far to the east, the Genos colony of Kaffa in Crimea showed how a fortified harbor could extend the reach of a distant republic. Kaffa was a walled city built on a peninsula, with a harbor enclosed by stone moles that were themselves topped by defensive towers. The walls ran all the way down to the water, and heavy gates could seal the port entirely. Inside this protected space, merchants from Genoa, Persia, and the Mongol territories exchanged goods in a setting as secure as any Italian plaza. The fortifications did more than repel pirates, they projected authority. Local rulers and rival traders understood that taking Kaffa by force would require a major siege, not a quick raid. This deterrence allowed Genos merchants to operate with confidence in a region where political controls shifted frequently. The security of the harbor was itself a form of trade policy, encouraging long-term investment and the accumulation of goods in warehouses that would not be plundered at the first sign of trouble. The economic logic behind these defenses was straightforward. A fortified harbor lowered the risk of loss. Merchants who knew their goods would be safe were willing to store larger quantities in port warehouses, and they were willing to pay higher docking fees for the privilege. This concentration of valuable cargo in turn attracted more buyers and sellers, creating a virtuous cycle where security fed volume and volume fed wealth. A harbor without defenses could offer the deepest channel and the fastest cranes, but merchants would avoid it if a single pirate raid could wipe out a season's profit. The cost of fortification was real, but the cost of insecurity was far higher. This security was itself a competitive advantage that went beyond simple protection. A safe harbor became known as a place where transactions could be trusted, where contracts would be honored because the threat of disruption was low. Over time, this reputation attracted not just goods but financial services, moneylenders, insurers, and brokers who needed a stable environment to operate. The walls and towers that ringed the harbor thus multiplied the economic activity inside them, turning a defensive structure into a generator of prosperity. The cities that understood this integration, that treated fortifications as a core part of their harbor design rather than an afterthought, were the ones that built lasting wealth. In this way, the chain across the harbor mouth was not separate from the quay where cargo was unloaded. The tower that held the catapult also housed the signal fire that guided ships home. The gate that blocked an enemy fleet also served as a customs checkpoint where fees were collected and records were kept. Defense and commerce were two sides of the same engineering effort, and the most successful ports wove them together into a single, inseparable system. The next step in this evolution would be to extend that protection beyond the harbor itself, to the entire coastline that connected one port to the next. Deeper docks unlocked the potential of larger ships, and those ships demanded even deeper docks. This was not a one-time improvement but a cycle that fed on itself. In the early medieval period, most vessels were small, shallow-drafted cogs and hulks, designed to beach on a tidal shore or tie up at a simple wooden jetty. They carried modest cargoes of timber, grain, wine, or wool, and they did not need much infrastructure. A few planks laid across the mud were enough to load a hogshead of wine. But as trade grew and merchants sought larger profits, shipwrights began to build bigger. The cog evolved into a taller, beamier vessel with a flat bottom that could still take the ground, but its high sides made unloading from a beach awkward. Goods had to be hoisted over the rail and lowered into lighters, a slow and risky process. Then came the carrack, a round-hulled, three-masted ship that rode deeper in the water and carried a full cargo hold below the waterline. It was more stable, more capacious, and seaworthy for long voyages, but it could not simply be run aground. It needed a quay with at least 4 or 5 meters of depth alongside. A harbor that could provide that depth could handle the carrack, a harbor that could not lose the trade. This is where the room and pillar warehouses of Venice became revolutionary. Inside the Venetian arsenal and along the quays of the Rialto, warehouses were built with long rectangular halls supported by rows of stone pillars. The space between the pillars was divided into standard bays, each one dedicated to a specific type of cargo: spices in one bay, wool in another, wine casks in a third. A carrack could tie up directly alongside and have its cargo unloaded into the correct bay within hours. The pillars allowed for easy stacking and access. The rooms were wide enough for carts to turn around, and the whole system was designed so that goods moved in a straight line from ship to storage to market without any backtracking. The time saved was dramatic. A ship that might have spent a week unloading and loading at a poorly equipped harbor could turn around in Venice in 2 or 3 days. That difference allowed Venetian merchants to make more voyages per season, spread their fixed costs across more cargo, and offer lower prices than competitors. In turn, the success of these larger, faster ships drove Venice to keep deepening its channels and widening its quays. Every time a new class of vessel appeared, the harbor engineers had to check the depth at the docks, the width of the turning basin, the clearance under the bridges. If a ship could not reach the warehouse because a canal was too narrow, the warehouse itself became useless. So the city invested in dredging, in widening canals, in replacing wooden bridges with stone arches that allowed taller masts to pass. The cycle was relentless. Each improvement invited a larger ship, and each larger ship demanded a further improvement. This feedback loop raised the economic stakes of harbor competition enormously. A city that fell behind in depth or quay space could not accommodate the most efficient vessels. Its merchants would be forced to use smaller, slower ships that carried less cargo and cost more per unit. Gradually, trade would flow away to the port that could handle the carrack or the full-rigged ship. The difference between a port that invested in deep water berths and one that did not was the difference between an empire and a backwater. And as the carrack gave way to the galleon and then the merchantman, the race to build bigger docks became a race to control the world's wealth. The harbors that won that race were not the ones with the most natural advantages. They were the ones that understood that a harbor and a ship were partners in an endless dance, and that the dance would not stop until one of them gave up. Pepper was the prize that made medieval fortunes, and Venice engineered its harbor to seize that prize from every rival. The spice routes from the east funneled through a narrow set of choke points, from the Malabar coast of India to the Red Sea, and then across Egypt to the Mediterranean. Whoever controlled the final leg of that journey, the transfer from ship to warehouse to market, could set the price for the entire continent of Europe. Venetian engineers did not just build deep channels and efficient quays. They built a system that made unloading a cargo of pepper faster than anywhere else. A galley returning from Alexandria carrying cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and peppercorns could tie up at the Rialto quay by midday, have its entire hold sorted and inspected within hours, and have the spices moving toward the warehouses along the Grand Canal before sunset. The customs officials worked alongside the dock crews, calculating duties on the spot and accepting payment within the same day. This speed was not a luxury. It was a competitive weapon that cut the cost of holding inventory and reduced the risk of spoilage or theft. In contrast, rival ports like Pisa or Marseille required ships to wait days for customs clearance and weeks for cargo to be moved to secure storage. Merchants who docked at those harbors faced delays that ate into their profit margins. A shipment of pepper that sat on a quay for a week could lose value from moisture, from pilferage, or simply from the interest charged on the loan that financed the voyage. Venetian efficiency meant that a merchant could sell his cargo, pay his crew, and invest in a new voyage before his competitor in Marseille had even cleared his first bale. The difference in turnaround time, measured in days rather than weeks, translated into a difference in annual profit that compounded year after year. This was not just about loading and unloading. It was about the entire rhythm of trade. Venetian harbor masters scheduled arrivals and departures with a precision that allowed multiple ships to use the same quay in sequence, maximizing the use of every meter of waterfront. They also offered lower customs duties for high-value spices, setting a rate that undercut every other Mediterranean port. The logic was simple. A lower duty per pound of pepper still generated enormous revenue when the volume passing through the harbor was the highest in the region. And by keeping the duty low, Venice attracted even more trade. The result was a self-reinforcing loop. More ships brought more spices, which brought more merchants, which generated more customs revenue even at a reduced rate per unit. The city captured the bulk of the pepper and cinnamon trade not because it was closest to the source, but because its harbor engineering made it the cheapest and fastest connection between the eastern supply and the European demand. A merchant who chose Venice did not just save a few days. He saved enough silver to make his entire voyage profitable, and in the race for the spice wealth, that margin decided which city would grow rich and which would be left with the scraps. The harbors that could not match this efficiency watched the caravels and galleys sail past, carrying the scent of pepper toward a lagoon where mud and stone had been turned into the engine of an empire. Stone and water alone never collected a single tax. That work fell to the harbor master. Every great port needed someone who understood not just the depth of the channel, but the value of every barrel and bale that crossed the quay. The harbor master was the bridge between engineering and revenue. He knew when the dredging was behind schedule, when a customs official needed a faster counting room, and when a delay at the wait station was costing the city more than a new crane ever could. The physical infrastructure of customs collection was as carefully designed as the breakwaters themselves. Counting houses stood at the edge of the quay, their windows facing the water so officials could watch every ship approach. Inside, long wooden tables served as inspection stations where goods were sorted, weighed, and recorded. The scales were not simple devices. They were large brass or iron balances, sometimes suspended from the ceiling, capable of handling sacks of wool or casks of wine. Each weighing was a transaction. The weight determined the duty, and the duty determined the revenue. The Venetian Dogana d'Armar, the customs house by the sea, was a masterpiece of this integration. Built at the entrance to the Grand Canal, its location was no accident. Every ship entering the heart of Venice had to pass within meters of its facade. Customs officials could see the cargo being unloaded before the vessel had even tied up. The building itself was designed for speed. Goods moved from the quay into a large central hall, where clerks recorded the type, quantity, and origin of every item. From there, the cargo passed to the wait station, then to the duty counter, and finally to the warehouse. The entire process was choreographed to minimize the time a merchant spent waiting. A delay at the Dogana was a delay in the entire trade cycle, and Venetian engineers designed the building to eliminate every unnecessary step. London took a different approach but with the same goal. The London Custom House, rebuilt several times over the centuries, sat directly on the Thames. Its Great Hall was a vast open space where merchants and officials could conduct business under one roof. The building included dedicated rooms for the weighing of wool, the inspection of cloth, and the assessment of wine. Each room had direct access to the quay, so goods did not have to be carried through crowded corridors. The design reflected a deep understanding of how trade flowed. A merchant could bring his cargo ashore, have it inspected and weighed, pay his duties, and receive his clearance without ever leaving the custom house grounds. These buildings were not just administrative centers, they were the places where engineering investment translated into actual revenue. A harbor that could unload a ship in hours rather than days allowed customs officials to process more ships in a single shift. A harbor with deep channels and wide quays attracted larger vessels carrying more valuable cargo, and more cargo meant more duties. The revenue from those duties paid for the next round of dredging, the next stone breakwater, the next warehouse. The cycle was self-sustaining, but only if the human systems matched the physical ones. A well-designed customs house was itself a form of harbor engineering. It reduced friction, speeded up transactions, and kept merchants coming back. The harbor master who understood this was as valuable as the engineer who designed the breakwater. Together, they turned a coastline into a machine for generating wealth. No customs house could collect revenue from a harbor that had lost its water. The whole machine of trade depended on one fragile connection, the channel that linked the city to the open sea. And when that channel closed, the wealth did not just slow down, it stopped. The story of Bruges is the most famous warning in medieval harbor history. In the 13th century, Bruges was the glittering jewel of the cloth trade, a place where merchants from Genoa, Venice, and the Hanseatic League gathered to buy Flemish woolens and sell Eastern spices. Its prosperity rested on the Zwin, a tidal channel that wound through the coastal marshes and connected the city to the North Sea. The Zwin was a natural waterway, but it was also a living thing, shifting with every storm, every tide, every season. To keep it open, the city spent enormous sums on dredging, on building wooden jetties to direct the current, on digging spillways to flush out sediment. For a time, these efforts worked. The channel stayed deep enough for the largest cogs and carracks, but the coastline of Flanders was not static. Rivers carried silt from the interior, and the sea itself was slowly depositing sand along the shore. Each winter, storms rearranged the bottom. Each spring, the channel was a little shallower. The dredging crews worked year after year, but the cost rose and the results shrank. By the 15th century, the Zwin had become unreliable. Ships of deep draft could no longer reach the quays of Bruges. They had to anchor at the outer port of Sluys, and cargo was transferred to smaller lighters for the final leg. This added days to every voyage and invited delays from weather, from congestion, from the simple friction of moving goods twice. Merchants began to calculate the cost, and the cost favored a rival. Antwerp, with its deeper connection to the Scheldt River, offered a direct route to the sea. Its harbor required less dredging, fewer intermediate transfers. The shift was gradual at first, then swift. By the end of the century, Antwerp had overtaken Bruges as the primary trading hub of the region. The city that had once commanded the cloth trade became a quiet town, its great warehouses empty, its canals still but carrying nothing. The engineers of Bruges had fought a noble battle. They built canals, they excavated basins, they studied the currents, but they were fighting against a geological process that required more than human effort could sustain. Without continuous investment at a level that exceeded the city's declining revenue, the channel could not be saved. And once the trade was gone, the revenue to fund further dredging was gone too. A similar fate befell Pisa, but in a different way. Pisa's harbor was never a tidal channel. It was the mouth of the Arno River, a broad waterway that gave access to the Tyrrhenian Sea. In the early medieval period, Pisa was a maritime power, rivaling Genoa and Venice. Its ships carried goods to Corsica, Sardinia, and the Levant, but the Arno was a river of sediment. Each flood brought tons of silt and sand downstream, depositing them at the mouth and slowly building a delta. The harbor that had once been deep enough for galleys gradually became too shallow for anything larger than a fishing boat. The city tried to dig new channels, to construct breakwaters, to dredge the riverbed, but the delta advanced relentlessly. By the later Middle Ages, Pisa's port was no longer on the sea. It was several kilometers inland, cut off from the coast by a broad band of marshy ground. The city that had once launched fleets to fight the Saracens could no longer launch a single merchant galley. Its trade dried up, and its rivals in Genoa and Florence took its place. These were not stories of sudden disaster. They were stories of slow, incremental loss. A channel that silted by a few centimeters each year did not become impassable overnight. It became a little harder to navigate, a little more expensive to use, a little less reliable. The ships that had once called regularly began to divert to better maintained ports. The harbor masters reported declining traffic. The customs revenue shrank. And with less revenue, the city could afford less dredging. The cycle turned downward, and no amount of heroic engineering could reverse it if the investment stopped. The lesson from Bruges and Pisa is not that nature always wins. It is that harbor engineering is not a one-time project. It is a permanent commitment. A city that builds a breakwater must maintain it. A city that dredges a channel must dredge it again next year and the year after for as long as it wants to stay in the trade. The moment a city decides that maintenance is optional, it has already begun to decline, and the fall, when it comes, is not a crash. It is a slow pulling away of the tide, leaving the quays high and dry, the cranes motionless, and the wealth of centuries stranded on a shore that no ship will ever reach again. What then could light a harbor that was already fading? Perhaps the answer lay not in mud and stone, but in the courage to build somewhere else entirely. Knowledge of harbors traveled farther than any ship. The greatest engineering secrets did not stay locked inside one city or one civilization. They moved along the same trade routes they helped create, carried by merchants who saw how a rival docked its vessels, by captured engineers who were put to work in foreign shipyards, and by scholars who translated dusty manuscripts into living practice. A port that could learn from its neighbors gained an advantage that no single generation of builders could invent on its own. The transfer of harbor knowledge was never a peaceful classroom exchange. It was a constant flow of observation, imitation, and improvement driven by the simple pressure of competition. When a Venetian merchant visited Alexandria and saw how the Arab harbor masters used a system of sequential basins to manage silt, he did not just admire the design. He returned home and whispered what he had seen to the engineers at the Arsenal. Within a decade, a similar idea appeared in the Venetian lagoon, adapted to local conditions. The knowledge moved not through formal treaties but through the eyes of traders who understood that a better harbor meant cheaper freight. Sicily and Spain became the great workshops of this knowledge transfer. When Arab dynasties ruled much of the Iberian Peninsula and the island of Sicily, they brought with them a deep tradition of hydraulic engineering refined in the deserts and rivers of the Middle East. They knew how to build underground channels called canals that carried water for irrigation. They understood how to line canals with stone to prevent erosion. In ports like Palermo and Almeria, Arab engineers constructed stone moles and breakwaters using techniques that had been tested for centuries on the coasts of North Africa and the Levant. A Norman ruler who conquered Sicily in the 11th century did not tear down these structures. He studied them. the stone quays of Palermo became a classroom for the shipwrights and masons of southern Italy, who carried that knowledge north to the growing maritime republics. The same process unfolded across the Strait of Gibraltar. The port of Almeria, under the Caliphate of Cordoba, was one of the most advanced in the medieval world. It had a deep channel protected by stone breakwaters on both sides. It had covered warehouses where goods could be stored away from the sun and the rain. It had a lighthouse that burned olive oil through the night. Christian armies that captured these cities in the later phases of the Reconquista did not destroy the harbors. They occupied them, repaired them, and learned from their design. The engineers of the emerging Atlantic powers, Portugal and Castile, studied the stonework of Almeria and adapted its principles for the rougher tides of the Atlantic coast. The written word played a role too. Maritime treatises circulated across the Mediterranean, sometimes in translation, sometimes carried by travelers who copied them by hand. The Byzantine manual, known as the Treatise on Shipbuilding and Harbor Construction, though lost in later centuries, was known to have influenced Italian engineers during the period of the Comnenian dynasty. Similar texts written by Arab scholars described how to calculate the correct slope for a breakwater, how to mix hydraulic mortar that would set underwater, and how to read the currents to predict where silt would accumulate. A city that possessed such a manual could rebuild its harbor even after disaster. A city that did not was forced to rely on trial and error, which cost time and lives. The ability to adopt and adapt foreign engineering was itself a competitive advantage. Some ports stagnated because their pride prevented them from copying a rival. Others thrived because they had the humility to steal a good design. The difference between a harbor that grew and one that shrank was often not the depth of the channel but the openness of the minds that managed it. Every stone quay on the coast of Europe carried the invisible signature of some earlier engineer, Arab, Byzantine, Roman, whose knowledge had traveled across centuries and language barriers to reshape a shoreline. The North Sea coast of Flanders became a laboratory for an entirely different kind of harbor engineering, one that did not rely on deep natural bays or sheltered lagoons, but on a network of artificial waterways carved by hand. Bruges in the 13th and 14th centuries was not a coastal city in the modern sense. It sat several kilometers inland, connected to the sea by a winding and unpredictable tidal channel called the Zwin. What made Bruges extraordinary was that its rulers refused to accept this limitation. They turned an inland town into the dominant port of northern Europe by building a system of canals, locks, and tidal gates that brought the sea to their doorstep. The engineers of Bruges understood that the tides were their greatest ally and their greatest enemy. Twice a day, the North Sea pushed a wall of water up the Zwin, raising the level of the channel by several meters. At high tide, ships of considerable draft could navigate the waterway and reach the city quays. At low tide, the channel shrank to a muddy creek. The solution was a system of artificial canals that branched off the Zwin and led directly into the heart of Bruges. These canals were lined with stone quays and equipped with wooden gates called tidal gates. At high tide, the gates were opened, allowing water and ships to flow into the inner basins. At low tide, the gates were closed, trapping the water inside and keeping the basins deep enough for vessels to remain afloat while they loaded and unloaded. This was not a passive system. It required constant management. Harbor masters calculated the exact time of each high tide and adjusted the gate schedules accordingly. Workers stood ready to open and close the heavy wooden barriers, sometimes in the middle of the night, because missing a single tide could delay a ship by an entire day. The inner basins themselves were excavated to depths of 4 or 5 meters, and the removed soil was used to raise the surrounding land above flood level. Every cubic meter of that excavation was dug by hand, carried in baskets, and dumped on shore. The result was a series of artificial harbors connected by a living pulse of tidal water. a system that gave Bruges the capacity to handle the largest cogs and carracks of the era. The toll system that grew around this infrastructure was equally sophisticated. Every ship that entered the Zwin paid a fee based on its draft, its cargo, and its port of origin. The revenues from these tolls were supposed to fund the continuous dredging and maintenance that kept the system alive. For a time, they did. Bruges became the great emporium of the north, where wool from England, cloth from Flanders, timber from the Baltic, and wine from Gascony changed hands alongside the spices and silks that arrived overland from Italy. The city's quays were crowded with merchants speaking every language of Europe, and its counting houses recorded transactions that fueled the wealth of an entire region. But the Zwin was not a stable partner. It was a dynamic, shifting waterway that carried enormous loads of sediment from the coastal currents and from the rivers that emptied into the North Sea. Each tide brought a fresh layer of sand and mud. Each winter storm rearranged the channel, carving new bends and abandoning old ones. The engineers of Bruges fought back with dredging fleets that worked year-round, scooping sediment from the bottom and dumping it far from the channel. They built wooden jetties that extended into the Zwin to concentrate the tidal flow and scour the bed deeper. They dug spillways to divert silt-laden water away from the main navigation route. For decades, these measures held the line. Then the line began to slip. The cost of dredging rose as the channel grew shallower, and the volume of sediment increased as the coastline itself shifted. The city's rulers faced a choice: raise tolls to fund more aggressive dredging, or accept that the Zwin would slowly close. They chose not to raise tolls, fearing that higher fees would drive merchants to competing ports. It was a decision made with good intentions, but it ignored the fundamental truth that a harbor is not a static asset. Deferring maintenance does not save money. It simply transfers the cost to the future with interest. By the early 15th century, the Zwin had become unreliable. Ships of deep draft could no longer reach Bruges at all. They anchored at the outer port of Sluys, and cargo was transferred to smaller, shallow draft vessels for the final leg into the city. This added days to every voyage, increased the risk of damage and theft, and raised the overall cost of trading through Bruges. Merchants began to calculate. Antwerp, with its deeper connection to the Scheldt River, offered a direct route to the sea without the need for transshipment. The difference in time and cost was not enormous on any single voyage, but over a season of multiple voyages, it compounded into a significant advantage. And in the competitive world of medieval trade, a small advantage repeated across dozens of merchants and hundreds of ships was enough to shift the center of gravity. The decline of Bruges was not a sudden collapse. It was a long, slow draining of activity that took decades to complete. Each year, a few more merchants chose Antwerp. Each year, a few fewer ships made the journey up the Zwin. The customs revenue shrank, and with it the funds available for dredging. The channel grew shallower still, accelerating the process. By the end of the 15th century, the great port of Bruges had become a quiet inland town. Its canals still beautiful, but carrying only local barges instead of ocean-going carracks. The wealth that had once filled its warehouses had migrated to Antwerp, which rose to become the dominant commercial center of northern Europe for the next century. What happened to Bruges was not a failure of engineering. The canals, the tidal gates, the jetties, and the dredging fleets were all remarkable achievements for their time. The failure was a failure of maintenance, a refusal to accept that the work of keeping a harbor open is never finished. The moment a city decides that it has done enough, that the channel is deep enough and the walls are high enough, it has already begun to lose ground. The Zwin did not stop silting because Bruges had built a good system. It kept silting relentlessly until the city could no longer afford to fight. and when the fight stopped, the harbor died, not with a dramatic collapse, but with the quiet resignation of a merchant who packs his goods and sails to a better port. The lesson from Bruges echoes through every harbor that has ever been built. The sea does not negotiate. It simply waits for the moment when human effort flags, and then it reclaims what was taken from it. The decline of one sea opened the door for another. As the Mediterranean harbors of Bruges and Pisa faded, a new center of gravity began to form along the Atlantic coast of Europe. The shift was not sudden. It was a slow migration of trade routes driven by the same forces that had made Venice and Genoa wealthy: the need for deeper channels, more secure anchorages, and the ability to handle larger ships. But the Atlantic presented a different set of challenges. The tides were stronger, the storms more violent, and the coastlines often lacked the natural shelter of the Mediterranean bays. The cities that would rise to power had to learn from the old masters and then build beyond them. Lisbon sat at the mouth of the Tagus River, a broad estuary that offered deep water and protection from the open ocean. But its harbor was not ready for the era of exploration. The river carried silt, and the channel required constant dredging. Portuguese engineers studied the Roman and Arab techniques that had worked in the Mediterranean and applied them on a larger scale. They built stone breakwaters that extended farther into the estuary, creating calm basins where caravels could be loaded and unloaded in safety. They dug dry docks along the riverbank, allowing shipwrights to repair hulls that had been battered by Atlantic voyages. And they constructed new quays with cranes that could handle the heavier cargoes of spices, gold, and slaves that began to flow from Africa and the Indian Ocean. The investment was enormous, but the payoff was the ability to launch voyages that no Mediterranean harbor could support. Seville faced a different obstacle. The city sat on the Guadalquivir River, nearly 100 kilometers inland from the Atlantic. To reach the sea, ships had to navigate a winding, shallow channel that was constantly shifting with sediment. The solution was a system of locks and dredging that kept the waterway open for the largest vessels of the era. Seville's harbor masters adopted the same tidal gate principles that had worked in Bruges, but they scaled them up for the larger ships of the Atlantic trade. They also built a massive customs house and warehouse complex at the port of Sanlúcar de Barrameda, where the river met the sea, so that goods could be transferred without the long journey inland. This allowed Seville to become the official port of entry for the Spanish Empire, the place where silver from the Americas was unloaded and recorded before it could shape the economies of Europe. Bristol, on the western coast of England, took a different path. Its natural harbor was a narrow tidal river, the Avon, that cut through deep gorges. The tides there were extreme, rising and falling by over 10 meters. A ship that entered at high tide could find itself stranded on mud at low tide. English engineers did not try to fight the tide. They worked with it, building floating docks that rose and fell with the water level, and constructing stone piers that extended into the deeper parts of the channel. They also invested in shipbuilding infrastructure, constructing dry docks and slipways that could handle the construction of the new ocean-going vessels that would carry English merchants to the Baltic, to the Mediterranean, and eventually across the Atlantic. The common thread across all these ports was adaptation. The principles that had guided Venetian and Genoese engineers: deep water, protected basins, efficient cargo handling, continuous maintenance, were not abandoned. They were amplified. Atlantic ports needed deeper channels because their ships drew more water. They needed stronger breakwaters because the waves were more powerful. They needed larger dry docks because the hulls were longer and heavier, but the underlying logic remained the same. A harbor was a machine for moving goods, and the better the machine, the more wealth it would generate. The result was a transformation of global trade. By the late 15th century, the Mediterranean was no longer the sole axis of commerce. the Atlantic routes from Lisbon to the Azores, from Seville to the Caribbean, from Bristol to Newfoundland, began to carry the bulk of the world's most valuable cargoes. The harbors that served these routes became the new centers of power, and the old maritime republics of the Mediterranean found themselves watching from the sidelines as the tide of history flowed westward. The engineering knowledge that had been refined over centuries in the harbors of Venice and Genoa did not die. It migrated, just as the trade did, to the shores of the Atlantic, where it would be tested on a scale that the medieval world could never have imagined. Every stone that shaped those Atlantic breakwaters carried a hidden price. The harbors that rose to dominate medieval trade were not built by wishful thinking or by the spare coins of a single merchant. They were the product of decades of sacrifice, of entire forests felled, of quarries hollowed out, and of thousands of workers who spent their lives moving earth and stone. The true cost of a great harbor was measured not in gold alone but in human effort, in political will, and in the willingness of a society to commit its resources to a project that might not pay off for a generation. The scale of material needed was staggering. A single breakwater like the Molo Vecchio in Genoa required hundreds of thousands of tons of stone. That stone had to be quarried from hillsides sometimes miles inland, then transported on ox carts or barges to the coast. Each block had to be shaped, lifted, and lowered into place, often underwater, using wooden cranes and teams of men hauling ropes. The timber alone for the scaffolding, the forms for concrete, the piles for foundations consumed entire forests. Shipwrights and carpenters worked alongside unskilled laborers in a coordinated effort that resembled a military campaign more than a construction project. The manpower required was immense. In Genoa, records from the 13th century show that the Molo Vecchio took more than 50 years to complete, with several hundred workers employed continuously. Some of those laborers were paid wages from city taxes. Others provided their labor as part of feudal obligations or civic duties, a practice that was common across medieval Europe. It was not always voluntary. Many projects relied on a system of compulsory service, where townspeople were required to contribute a certain number of days per year to public works. In times of need, rulers could also conscript workers from the surrounding countryside, a burden that fell heavily on the poorest families who could least afford to lose a breadwinner. Guilds and merchant associations played a critical role in financing these efforts. A harbor was not just a public amenity, it was the lifeblood of trade, and the merchants who depended on it were willing to pay for its upkeep. In Venice, the merchant guilds levied their own taxes on cargo and contributed directly to the dredging funds. In Genoa, wealthy families and trading companies bought shares in harbor projects, essentially lending money to the city in exchange for future revenues from docking fees. This created a direct link between those who benefited from the harbor and those who paid for it. It also meant that the project could continue even when the city treasury was empty, as long as there were merchants who believed in the future. Yet such collective financial commitment required political stability. A city torn by factional infighting or ruled by a weak leader could not sustain the long-term investment needed for a major harbor. Genoa itself was notorious for its internal conflicts, with noble families feuding in the streets. But when it came to the Molo, they somehow found common ground because everyone understood that the harbor was the source of their wealth. That unity was fragile and sometimes broke down, delaying work for years. It was a constant reminder that harbor engineering was as much a political achievement as a technical one. The barrier to entry for smaller polities was almost insurmountable. A town that lacked the tax base, the labor force, or the political cohesion to build a stone breakwater could never compete with a Venice or a Genoa. They might carve a small basin into a creek bank or build a wooden jetty, but they could not handle the deep draft ships that carried the most valuable cargoes. So the gap between the great harbors and the small ones widened over time, reinforcing the dominance of a few major ports. In this way, the hidden costs of harbor engineering shaped the entire geography of medieval power, creating a world where only the richest and most determined cities could afford to reach for the sea. Behind every great harbor lay a simple truth. The men who designed those breakwaters and dredged those channels were not thinking about concrete or sediment alone. They were thinking about power. The decision to build a stone pier or to deepen a channel was never a neutral choice. It was a deliberate act of statecraft, a move in a long game of economic warfare that determined which cities would command the trade routes and which would be left to watch from the shore. The medieval harbor was a weapon, and the engineers who shaped it were generals fighting a silent war for imperial ambition. When we step back and look at the full sweep of this story, 5 factors emerge as the pillars that supported every successful port. The first is location, but not in the simple sense of a good bay or a sheltered inlet. The great ports did not just find a good spot. They chose places where geography could be bent to human will. Venice took a shallow lagoon and carved deep channels through it. Genoa took an exposed coastline and built a stone arm to tame the waves. The Hanseatic cities took a network of shallow Baltic rivers and turned them into a unified system. Location was not destiny. It was raw material that engineering could transform. The second factor is the quality of engineering itself. The difference between a port that thrived and one that declined often came down to how well its breakwaters were built, how deep its channels were cut, and how effectively its quays resisted the constant battering of waves and salt. A poorly built breakwater might collapse in the first winter storm. A channel dredged to 4 meters but not to 5 would exclude the largest ships. The cities that invested in the best materials, in Roman concrete, in carefully fitted stone, in foundations driven deep into the seabed, were the ones whose harbors lasted for generations. The third factor is maintenance, and this is perhaps the most important lesson of all. No harbor ever stayed deep on its own. Every channel silted, every breakwater cracked. Every quay needed repair. The cities that succeeded were the ones that treated maintenance as a permanent obligation, not a one-time project. They budgeted for dredging every year. They trained specialized crews. They passed laws to protect the channels from dumping and obstruction. They understood that a harbor is not a static asset. It is a living system that requires constant care. The moment a city decided it had done enough, the harbor began to die. The fourth factor is security. A harbor that could not defend its wealth would soon have no wealth to defend. The chains, the towers, the fortified walls, and the controlled entrances were not afterthoughts. They were essential components of the harbor's design. A safe harbor attracted more merchants who paid higher fees, who funded better defenses. An insecure harbor repelled trade, reduced revenue, and weakened the very infrastructure it needed to survive. Security was not separate from commerce. It was the foundation on which commerce rested. The fifth factor is organization. The greatest harbors were not just physical structures. They were systems of workers, customs officials, shipwrights, and merchants all operating with a shared purpose. The Venetian arsenal was not remarkable simply because of its dry docks and canals. It was remarkable because of the way those dry docks were managed, the way parts were standardized, the way labor was coordinated. The Hanseatic system worked not because of any single impressive pier, but because the League cities shared knowledge, pooled resources, and maintained a common standard of efficiency. Organization turned stone and water into wealth. These 5 factors, location, engineering, maintenance, security, and organization, did not operate in isolation. They reinforced each other. A well-chosen location made engineering easier. Good engineering reduced maintenance costs. Strong security attracted more trade, which funded better organization. And good organization ensured that all the other factors were sustained over time. The cities that mastered this cycle rose to dominate the medieval world. The cities that neglected even one of these factors saw their fortunes slip away. What is striking is how little the underlying logic has changed. The ports that dominate global trade today, from Shanghai to Rotterdam to Singapore, are still competing on the same terms. They are chosen for their location, they are engineered for depth and capacity, they are maintained through constant dredging and repair, they are secured against disruption. And they are organized with a precision that would have amazed the harbor masters of medieval Venice. The scale has changed, the ships are larger, the cranes are powered by electricity, and the customs data moves through fiber optic cables. But the fundamental challenge remains the same. A port is a machine for moving goods, and the port that moves them faster, cheaper, and more reliably will capture the flow of wealth. This is the lasting relevance of the medieval story. The engineers who built the Molo Vecchio and the Arsenal and the canals of Bruges were not working on problems that have been solved. They were working on problems that are permanent. The sea will always try to fill a channel. The waves will always try to break a wall. The silt will always try to close a harbor. And the cities that understand this, that treat harbor engineering not as a one-time achievement but as a continuous struggle, are the ones that will keep their doors open to the world. In the end, the lesson from the medieval harbor is not about stone or water. It is about the human will to shape the environment for a purpose. Every breakwater that still stands today is a monument to that will. Every channel that remains deep is a testament to generations of unseen labor. And every city that rose to power through its port is a reminder that the tools of statecraft are not always swords and treaties. Sometimes they are cranes and dredges, built by people who understood that controlling the coastline was the first step to controlling the world. That understanding shaped the fate of nations. The harbors we have explored were not just engineering projects, they were the physical expression of a city's will to power. Venice carved deep channels through a muddy lagoon and turned that unlikely foundation into the wealthiest republic of the medieval world. Genoa built a stone arm against the open sea and held it for centuries, commanding trade routes that stretched to the Black Sea and beyond. Constantinople sat at the crossroads of continents, its harbors and its great chain guarding the gateway between east and west. And Bruges, for all its ingenuity, showed that no channel stays deep without relentless commitment. Each of these cities made choices about where to dig, what to build, and how long to maintain. Those choices determined whether their wealth would grow or fade. The lesson etched into every breakwater and dredged channel is that infrastructure is not a backdrop to history. It is a driving force. The cities that invested wisely, that treated their harbors as permanent responsibilities, rose to dominate trade routes and shape the course of events. The ones that neglected maintenance or failed to adapt saw their influence drain away with the tide. This pattern did not end with the medieval world. It continues in every port that handles the flow of global commerce today. The same principles of location, engineering, maintenance, security, and organization still decide which cities thrive and which fall behind. The names have changed, but the logic remains as constant as the sea itself. If this story of hidden power and human ingenuity has sparked your curiosity about the forces that shaped our world, consider subscribing. There are more stories waiting beneath the surface, tales of forgotten engineers and the quiet structures that made empires possible.